All right. Well, welcome to the weekly roundup at the American Prospect. David Dayen is off today, so I, editor-at-large Harold Meyerson, will be conducting a conversation of the week's events, such as they were, with a wonderful guest who I met when he was this mere barely out of childhood. Adam Serwer was a writing fellow for the American Prospect a number of years ago. And like a number of Prospect former writing fellows, he's gone on to all kinds of great stuff. He is currently and has for a while been one of the stars at the Atlantic. And he's also something that's particularly helpful as we navigate through these ridiculous times, and that is he was on to Donald Trump in many ways, and more profoundly, just before pretty much anyone. It was Adam who really at the start of Trump's first term, when they began separating children from their parents at the border, wrote a line which, never has left anyone who follows Trump, which is the cruelty is the point. And he's elaborated on that in further writings, book, articles. He's also one of the winners of the annual Sidney Hillman prizes for commentary, of which I am one of the judges, and we give one each year. So he's in the company of Murray Kempton, Edward R. Murrow, and rightly so, I would say. So, Adam, welcome to the Prospects Weekly Roundup.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Harold.
Well, it was also accurate, not not merely kind. So we've had a week headlined by Donald Trump's State of the Union address and the usual kind of junk that comes out of the Trump administration. I'm struck by the fact, by the way, that just in the last 24 hours, we have seen a kind of stunning series of 180s from Trump. First, pulling back on a number of the tariffs that he had imposed on Canada and Mexico, and then just this in the last few hours, uh, threatening Russia with sanctions since it unloaded all kinds of missiles and bombs over Ukraine last night, and suddenly saying he'd like to negotiate with Iran on its nuclear status, which has been not only something that Trump has opposed, but the Republican Party has opposed for well over a decade. I get the sense that this is sort of uh, a function of Trump's not actually having any beliefs other than narcissism and his need to get revenge. And preferably, as Adam pointed out, he needs to get his revenge in the most cruel manner as possible. Uh, Adam, how do you assess such as it is the core of Donald Trump?
I actually think he's highly ideological on questions of race. I think you could trace that back to,
Yes.
uh, getting busted for segregated housing back in the day. I think he has a very, ironically, given his image as a populist, I think he has a very sort of racist and classist conception of society. That he manages to get away with, in part through these expressions of contempt that somehow make people feel as though he's just a regular guy, or make people feel like they have some sort of kinship with him because he expresses contempt for people they also feel contempt for. The tariffs have to be one of the most confusing aspects of the Trump administration, because you could sort of imagine theoretically, he imposes tariffs and then American businesses have to come to him hat in hand begging for exemptions, and he can personally or politically profit from that in some way. But never actually, but like threatening the tariffs constantly and then withdrawing them diminishes them as a threat to other countries. It creates economic uncertainty. Businesses have to make long-term investment decisions, on the basis of what they think their costs will be. So it hurts the economy without getting any of the actual benefits you would get from, or theoretically get from protecting American businesses from competition. It's just a very confusing um, aspect of his administration, and it makes me wonder. And again, this is speculation. It makes me wonder to what extent, the last Trump administration was very much a sort of series of competing fiefdoms, right? There were people jockeying for power within the administration, and you had these little power struggles where sometimes certain factions would win, sometimes others factions would win, and they would get to set policy. And I think, maybe what we're seeing right now, this sort of will hear, won't hear about the tariffs is, about chaos within the administration about who's making the decisions and what decision is actually going to get made.
Well, there are sort of competing fiefdoms, I think, within the mind of Donald Trump, because as you were saying, he likes to act in a capacity where companies would have to come to him on bended knee. He loves that
Mm.
entities, people, companies, you name it, come to him on bended knee and say, yes, you get an exemption. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, he is, as you said, not just a racist, but a classist. And if he's hurting Wall Street and the business community, that rubs up against his wanting to inflict the general pain and have them come to him on the above mentioned bended knee. And so I think we're seeing those two things jockeying even in the mind of Donald Trump. And speaking of the classes thing, he's also doing an event today. He may have already done it. Sort of welcoming crypto into the company of great American enterprises. Lord only knows what financial panics, are in store for us as a result of this. Let's talk about the premier event of the week, which was the State of the Union address, uh, which, was really kind of simply a campaign speech delivered from the well of the House of Representatives. Didn't really have much of an ask to the Congress as far as the legislative agenda goes, partly because he believes he can do it through executive order. He can do it all himself. But certainly going after not just the Democrats, although that was a lot of it, but his usual favorite targets. I think the person he mentioned most in his speech was Joe Biden, which is, to put it mildly, not exactly the pattern that current presidents do in American history when they first deliver a speech to Congress. They usually don't dwell on what their predecessors did. And Franklin Roosevelt didn't dwell on what Herbert Hoover did as such. You look at his early speeches, and there's not really much mention of Hoover, even though Franklin Roosevelt was elected because Hoover did not know how to deal with the Depression. But that was kind of pure Trump.
Well, I think, it's important for him right now because the economy looks like it's headed into headwinds. And he got elected, presumably on the basis, for a lot of people, not his hardcore supporters, but the sort of marginal Trump voters, wanted him to lower the price of groceries. And now, you might as well propose to someone, kneeling on one knee, with an egg in your hand for how expensive they become. So I think, it's important for him to have a scapegoat I think you sort of look at that and he's anticipating that something is not going to go right and he needs to be able to blame Joe Biden for it. And, there's immense, we used to talk about how significant Fox News was as a propaganda organ. But now, you have all these social media companies and other sources of information that are controlled by, billionaires who have aligned themselves politically with Donald Trump. So, he has, if anything, an even greater enhanced ability to create a fictional universe in which, the problems that he causes are somebody else's fault. And I think that's what he's attempting to do there. He's anticipating that there are going to be some problems with the economy as a result of decisions he's made. Elon Musk who he's practically handed off the presidency to, has said, we're going to have to inflict suffering for greater prosperity. And by suffering, he means firing lots of people and cutting his own taxes. Um, and I just think that aspect of the speech is really about, making sure that when those problems come, he has someone to blame for it. And I think, I just want to dwell for a second on what you said about him thinking he could do things by executive order. I mean, look, appropriations are laws. Congress passes those. What he's doing right now is legislating from the White House. It's unconstitutional. He shouldn't be allowed to do it. If for decades, what we've heard from right-wing justices is, well, if you want to do something, you should pass a law. And now we have the most basic of laws, appropriations. Congress says you spend money on this, this, and this, and the president is simply disregarding it. And when you look at the dissent from the USA case earlier this week, you basically have four justices on the Supreme Court who don't think Article 1 exists when a Republican president is in the White House. So I think we're in a very dangerous situation. I think most of the stuff that Trump is doing is blatantly illegal and unconstitutional. And I think I don't want to use the word normalization because it gets thrown around so much, but I think the magnitude of what he's doing here is very significant, because if Congress doesn't even get to use the power of the purse, and the whole constitutional structure of the government of the United States that has existed for centuries is no longer enforced.
Well, and that raises a question about something we'll be facing 1 week from today, which is the expiration of congressional allocation of funds, and would the government shut down? And there's discussion as to what the Democrats should do about this, and there's a strong sentiment within the Democratic caucus to say we're only going to vote to keep the government open if we get a pledge that the money that is forthcoming from keeping the government open from that decision does in fact keep coming, and there's no more arbitrary Trump impoundments of money and arbitrary overturning of agencies that have been established by Congress. Bob Kuttner actually has an on tap today that either is posted just now or will post shortly about this. But can the Democrats condition a vote on keeping the government open by saying, and it's the law here that you can't override previous congressional appropriations that are in law. Now, of course, Trump might not, agree to that. And as you pointed out, there are at least four Supreme Court justices who seem indifferent to the first article of the Constitution, but it's a possibility. And what do you think about that as a Democratic option in a week from now?
I mean, I think everything that Musk is doing all basically should be undone. What he's done is illegal. He has no legal authority whatsoever. The president does not have a constitutional authority to impound funds. He doesn't have a legal authority either because of the Impoundment Act.
Right.
This is an assault, on the most, basic roots of American constitutional government. And the Democrats should not in any way enable it. And, the Republicans know this. It's actually quite extraordinary. Because they're trying to get Elon's cuts legislated into law because they understand that actually they're not legal at all. But and then you have these stories about Republicans going to Elon hat in hand asking him to reverse certain cuts for their own. I mean, I think that when we talk, conservatives love to invoke the founders. Do you think the founders thought that there would be a Congress so meek and supplicant that they
Supine
would
is the word
sell
that comes
out
to mind.
their constitutional authority to the richest man in the world and then just be begging him for scraps instead of using their constitutional authority to assert their powers as one of the branches of government. It's astonishing. It's astonishing, especially given, this sort of ultra masculinization of Republican politics. Then you have all these guys, acting like, Reek from Game of Thrones, because I'm sure this is a family podcast and I can't say exactly what I'd like to say about it.
Yeah. Yes, it's a completely supine, neutered Republican Congress.
Well,
And
there's a PG version, yes.
yes, yes,
Uh,
yes. Well, we
Gelded.
we've strived to reach our family values here. So no, you're right. And also contrast this with the Republican and particularly Republican Supreme Court justices' supposed reference for originalism. What did the founders intend? Well, James Madison was chiefly concerned with the possibility that a despot could rise and really overthrow whatever democratic tenets were written into the Constitution. And he based a lot of the Constitution on the French philosophe Montesquieu, who said, well, to avoid despotism, you need separation of powers, and to which we've added the phrase checks and balances, which is sort of what separation of powers meant, but that you do not concentrate all power in one branch of government. And so we have three. You would think you don't even you certainly don't need an LLB or an MA in history to know that this was a prime motivator of the people who wrote the Constitution. And yet here we are, and the whole theory of the unitary executive, which there's judicial pushback to. There was a court ruling yesterday that said no, Donald Trump cannot fire Gwen Wilcox from the National Labor Relations Board because there is a law that enshrines her position until 2028. And there's also a Supreme Court decision from 1935, which says the president, that was, by the way, all nine justices signed on to this, that said the president cannot, get rid of commissioners on independent agencies who have set terms set by Congress once they are appointed and confirmed. But I mean, history apparently began on January 20th for the Republican Congress and a number of Supreme Court justices. Forget everything that came before that. That's merely not merely non-originalist. It's like, selective amnesia is what it is.
Well, look, some of the justices are fully Trumpified.
Yeah.
And I think we can already, going back to his speech, we have this remarkable scene where Donald Trump is exiting and he pats Chief Justice John Roberts on the back, says, "Thank you. I won't forget." And then he tried to say, "Well, I was just thanking him for swearing me in," which is just, eh, eh, how does a guy who lies this badly um, manipulate so many people. I mean, it's the sort of the dog ate my homework. That's how plausible it is. But he does have a lot to thank John Roberts for because this whole sort of originalist, quote unquote, vandalism of the Constitution on Trump's behalf, it begins with the justices saying, just pretending the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment doesn't exist. The ban on insurrectionists, which was, put in there to prevent people who try to overthrow the United States government from holding political office ever again. They just decided to rewrite the Constitution, from what is explicitly laid out in the text, which they are supposedly deferential to ideologically. They just completely ignore it. They write it out of the Constitution. And then to defend Donald Trump from criminal prosecution, they insert this imperial grant of power, which, as you point out, the founders absolutely would not have recognized, to protect Donald Trump from prosecution and give him he's running wild in this term because of that ruling, because he has this sort of immunity, this extra constitutional immunity that has no basis whatsoever in the text of the Constitution that was granted to him by the Constitution's so-called originalists, because fundamentally they're Trumpists. And I think, the thing to understand here about originalist interpretation is that it's not so much about looking at history or looking at text. It's about looking in the mirror. Conservatives look in the mirror and they say, we're just like the founders. So whatever we believe, the founders believe, and therefore that's what the Constitution says. And then ultimately, it does not matter at all what the Constitution says. It's a kind of, almost emotional therapy and self-discovery, where they discover what the Constitution means by looking at themselves and realizing that the true founders, are within them all along.
Yes, I think the James Madison would probably not recognize himself in Samuel Alito, however. So it's a it is a major problem. Speaking of it is a major problem, let's get to the Democratic responses to the State of the Union, all of which have been variously panned, including Al Green standing up and shaking his cane, including sitting there holding little placards saying it's not true or defend Medicaid or what have you. Uh, Frankly, it is not clear to me that there's much of there was much percentage there wasn't much reason to show up. I think perhaps just staying away would have been a better response. I thought the actual official response delivered by newly elected Michigan Democratic Senator Alyssa Slotkin was pretty good. Other responses that were personal, Bernie Sanders taped one, other people's, other prominent Democrats taped them. Some of them were pretty good. But sitting there was simply a form of being a sitting duck, which is not the image I think the Democrats want to convey to themselves or to the electorate at large. You have any thoughts on that, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, the Democrats' response has been to um, communicate. I think that uh, you know what Trump is doing, which is far more radical than he was doing in his first term, is actually okay. And it's not, because they're opposing it, but they're not opposing it with the same. I mean, we could take the Al Green thing as an example. The leadership did not defend Al Green. They allowed the Republicans to censure him. Most Democrats voted against it. 10 voted in favor. I think mostly or overwhelmingly from Trump districts. But what I find shocking is, not only that those 10 votes flipped, but that the leadership was completely silent on it. None of them said who are the Republicans to talk about decorum and respect, especially after that speech. And this, I think, they simply, Schumer and Jeffries simply dodged the question when asked directly instead of defending Al Green and saying he has a right to speak out against the most powerful person in the country. He has a right. I thought we believed in free speech. And I think this sort of response, and I think what the Democrats think they're doing is they're sort of avoiding a fight that they think they can't win. But I think one of the problems that Democrats have had over the past couple of years is not necessarily, there's this whole question of popular versus unpopular and moderate versus liberal. But I think one of the biggest problems they've had is that their unwillingness to stand up for certain unpopular positions that might be correct has communicated that actually they don't believe in anything. Right. So, I think a lot about this image of after the George Floyd murder where, they're sort of kneeling in kente cloth and it's become sort of an internet meme. But I don't think that becomes an internet meme if the Democrats just like actually pass some sort of police reform bill. And I think the reason that image has become this sort of, thing for mocking Democrats is because they don't, it seems like it's fake. Like they say these things, they express these ideas, and then they don't stick up for them. Um, and as a result of that, people think that they're cynical. Like a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump disagree with some of the things he says, but they like the fact that he has principles, even though those principles are bad. Like that doesn't make sense to me. It's the old strong and wrong is better than weak and
Mhm.
right thing that Bill
Right.
Clinton used to talk about. So I think, in some sense, uh, the Democrats' response has been inadequate, not simply because it's not like the right, focus grouped, popular type of response that hits swing voters right on the target, but because they're so focused on calibrating the perfect response that they can't just stand up for basic American values when they're under assault.
Well, let's maybe identify a couple of Democrats who deviate
Yes, I
from
mean
that.
there are quite a
I mean,
few. I mean, you
certainly,
could look at, I mean, Green himself, obviously,
yeah,
AOC,
Bernie, certainly.
Bernie. There's a lot of people who who are trying to speak up, but the leadership is not really supporting that effort. In fact, there was a story in Axios about them scolding people for being too strident, and I just think that's a mistake because not because you need to go out there and be as disruptive as possible, but I think voters do need to get a sense that you are not simply a politician in an empty suit who has no principles, because unfortunately, the perception that Donald Trump is a person of integrity comes from his nastiness and his willingness to say horrible things. And if you simply allow him to disrespect you like that, in some sense, you are confirming the impression that he is painting of you as someone who is, without principle and therefore cannot be trusted with political power.
So if you're counseling Democrats about the 2026 election, they're clearly probably going to run, clearly, probably, whatever that means. They're probably going to run on economic issues. And it is the case that in his State of the Union address, Donald Trump and the 100 very long minutes that he was speaking maybe devoted 5 minutes to economic issues because he wants to, he's has a sense, as you said, that it's not going to be good, and so he's going to blame Joe Biden. But he spent the other 85 minutes on personal retribution and culture war issues, largely. And
I mean, I think on
Yeah,
some of that stuff, it's not as though the Republican positions on a lot of that stuff are popular, but they take them and they defend them, and it looks like they,
right,
have principles, even though those principles are bad. And look, I'm not a political, consultant. I can't
right.
tell you how to win an election campaign. I can just tell you my impression of what's happening. And I think if you're the Democrats and you're sitting there saying to yourself, well, thermostatic public opinion is going to take care of it, so we don't really need to do anything. I think that's a huge mistake. I think you need to some extent go on offense, especially on some of these culture war issues, uh, you know, because your constituencies are being harmed by the things Republicans are doing. And you have to defend those constituencies by defending basic American values like free speech, inclusion, people's basic fundamental rights to exist and live their lives the way that they want to live them.
Well,
And if you refuse to do that, because you've seen some polling on the issue that suggests that some of that stuff isn't so popular, then you're going to cement this impression I think Republicans have very successfully painted Democrats as, which is that they don't believe the things that they say. They just say them just to say them, and therefore they're not people of principle at all.
and what the Republicans term as DEI, attacking that is really clearly going after some fundamental, civil rights.
I mean, they're dismantling the civil
Yeah,
rights offices of
right.
every department in the federal government. What this is an effort. I've written about this. I wrote a piece called "The Great Resegregation" for the Atlantic. And the aim of this is to essentially roll back the clock to before the Civil Rights Act existed. What they want is it to be legal to dole out opportunities on the basis of race and gender. And they're not going to do that by explicitly, bringing back Jim Crow or anything like that. But what they're going to do is undermine anti-discrimination law to the point where it basically doesn't exist and isn't really enforced. And therefore, people who are subject to discrimination, particularly in the workplace, have no recourse. And this is a direct assault on one of the Democratic Party's most important constituencies, which is Black Americans. And you're not seeing a ton of pushback on, what is an attempt to reverse one of the most important events in the history of the United States, which is the Civil Rights Movement. And it's sort of it, an extraordinary thing to see because they've I guess because they've decided that DI doesn't poll very well or something like that. They have not allowed themselves to respond forcefully enough to what the Republicans are doing. I mean, they're tearing down, in schools run by the Department of Defense, where military families send their children on bases. They're tearing down posters of Harriet Tubman because that's DEI. Now, that is racist. It's so extraordinarily racist that it sort of blows my mind that that people are just sort of doing it, and the only people responding are the children themselves who protested Hegseth over this. I just think, and it's not as though it's just like an abstract thing. I mean, we saw, you know, the replacement of the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who was a four-star general with a white three-star general. We've seen several high-ranking female military officers be removed. I mean, this is
The head of the
not,
Navy.
this is not an abstract thing that is happening here. They are doing this.
Yeah,
And I think if you decide like, well, we're not going to defend the ideal of non-discrimination. We're not going to defend people's civil rights because we can just talk about the price of eggs. I think that's not going to work as well as you think it will, because these people have such an ability through through the various, whether it's Fox News or whether it's social media, through their various propaganda organs to reframe the conversation around this issue or that issue, that if you are not prepared to fight on that sort of terrain, you're going to struggle even when, the sort of economic fundamentals of the election are trending in your favor.
one of the things that I learned from really my one and only mentor, who was Michael Harrington, the American Democratic Socialist, is that we make a mistake when we take the legislative achievements of the 1930s and the 1960s as being permanent. Uh, clearly,
Absolutely.
yeah, clearly what we're seeing is an assault on some of the fundamental reforms of the 1960s, both the civil rights legislation, the establishment of Medicaid, maybe paring back on Medicare as well, and the 1930s with for which maybe the two
Labor law, Social
yeah,
Security. They're trying to
exactly,
repeal both the Great Society and the New
exactly,
Deal, which
exactly.
has been their goal for, I mean, as you know, Harold, I mean, you've
Yes.
written about it so much. I mean, like it's extraordinary, for all this stuff about Donald Trump and this new populism, whatever. This is
Right.
this is Hooverism.
Yeah. Yeah.
In some basic sense, like this is just, what the conservative movement has been trying to do for more than a century.
Exactly. And Michael Harrington's line in a number of speeches was, we have to go as far beyond Roosevelt as Roosevelt went beyond Hoover, or we are going back to Hoover. Sadly, that appears somewhat prophetic. I mean, there are now, as there have never been before, lawsuits from Amazon and some other companies essentially to gut the National Labor Relations Act. And I am not pleased to report that these have been opposed in court by the unions that have been affected, that would be affected if this happened, chiefly the Teamsters, since a lot of this concerns Amazon's refusal to bargain with the Staten Island warehouse workers who voted 3 years ago already that they to establish a union, and as Amazon has not yet come to the table and sat down with them. And by up until Trump took office, this was opposed by the NLRB. Well, the NLRB has now sort of quietly withdrawn itself from a suit that questions its own existence, leaving the Teamsters as the only party opposed to the lawsuits from organizations like Amazon. So yeah, so it's the 1930s order under which we have lived, however imperfectly, since 1937 when the court upheld the NLRA, and the 1960s, which we have lived since 1964 and 5 with basic civil rights and the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid. That's a rug that, they're pulling out from under us. And yes, this has been, as you say, the goal of the conservative movement for time immemorial. Um, and right now they have enough clout, to try to, sweep away what were merely right-wing fantasies, for in the preceding decades.
I think, when you go back to Reconstruction, those disenfranchisement laws substantially affected the white poor. They were aimed at black people,
Right,
but they affected the white poor significantly. And the South was, underdeveloped and very extremely poor because of segregation for decades until the New Deal. And so I think, on the one hand, like these things are not separate, right? This belief in racial determinism and racial hierarchy expressed in this attempt to undermine anti-discrimination law goes hand in hand with this desire to use Donald Trump as a vehicle to make like the most horrendous exploitation of workers as legal as possible. This is, these projects, the people who are aligned with Donald Trump, there might be more excited about one or the other, but they go hand in hand. So this assault on the civil rights of racial and ethnic minorities, on LGBT people, on women, that goes hand in hand with this desire to exploit workers because both of them have in mind the weakening of the arms of the state that protect regular people from the predatory intentions of the wealthiest people in society who simply believe that the laws and rules should not apply to them in any respect. And we are saying that. I mean, that's what Doge is. It is an attempt to disregard entirely the law and the Constitution so that one man, the richest man in the world, can do whatever he wants.
right.
And
No, and there was a column recently in the New York Times by Stephen Ratner, who is a long ago a New York Times economics reporter who became, a rich Wall Street guy himself, and he was sort of saying, you'd be surprised how many CEOs, including Democratic CEOs, are still to say that they're quietly that they're okay with what Trump is doing, and I think
oh,
what
that doesn't surprise me at all.
yeah,
I think that I am
right.
the opposite of surprised by that.
Right. No, I join you in that, but he doesn't really dig that deep into why that is. I think there is an inherently autocratic mindset that a lot of these you know Wall Street and CEO types have, that is clearly manifest in their uniform hatred of unions. I mean, you struggle to find anyone in a C-suite who has anything positive to say about workers having a modicum of power over the conditions in which they work. And essentially they see in Trump a guy who has got similarly autocratic impulses that make clear that, it's it's the guy on top, and it's usually a guy, not a gal. It's the guy on top who is entitled to make all the decisions. This is unitary executivism spread across, the C-suites of America. And so yes, it's not a surprise. So I was a little surprised Stephen Ratner, who has not exactly been a left winger, wrote this piece. And it also, and in a sense, I remember one of the founders of the American Prospect, Robert Reich, was writing as early as the Prospect's founding in 1990 about the secession of the rich, and that was evident in their indifference to American workers when they offshored their facilities because they could find cheaper workers and fewer labor standards if they went to other countries. And the secession of the rich is, continues in the utter indifference that they show to American workers, in the utter indifference they often show to any kind of people who don't look like them, i.e., white and male. And in now a kind of sense that, well, Donald Trump's doing some silly stuff and he shouldn't be imposing tariffs one day and not imposing them the next day. But he's with us in his sense of who should rule and how.
Yeah, it's it's like that line, I feel bad for my country, but this is tremendous content, except, I feel bad for my country, but my profits are up. I mean, it really goes back to the case for unions, right? I mean, these guys have all the power and all the money, and what you have is your labor. And collectively, you can use your labor to get better conditions for you and your colleagues. And they don't like that. They want to be able to pay you as little money as possible for as much work as possible. And the only way you can change that, especially in certain workplaces, is by forming a union. And I think, the contempt for their own workforce is something you could see, in especially, with the sort of right-wing tech lurch. They're afraid of these white collar workers. They don't want them to unionize. They don't want them to band together and use their power in a way that's going to undermine their goals. And because, college educated workers became significantly more liberal over the past few years, these bosses who want to exploit those white collar workers went right. And obviously, not every tech workforce is white collar. I mean, you mentioned the Amazon warehouse workers, but it's the same thing. They want to make as much money as possible, paying people as little as possible. And the only way you can change that is by forming a union. So as
Yeah,
far as they're concerned, if Donald Trump wants to nuke, American labor law and every labor protection there is, they're fine with that. They don't care. They make
they're
more
fine.
money.
Yeah. Now, Bezos, I think Jeff Bezos, has pretty much devised what he thinks is a foolproof way to avoid unions. The Amazon warehouse work is so exhausting that there is 150% turnover of Amazon warehouse workers in a given year, which is to say the average Amazon warehouse workers can only, stay on the job for about 8 months before his or her body is telling them no way, you got to get out of here. And so that deals with the warehouse workers. The drivers, the Amazon delivery folks, are subcontracted out. They wear Amazon uniforms, they drive Amazon trucks, they have an Amazon surveillance camera in the truck cab to make sure that they're not sitting back catching their breath between stops. But they're nominally employed by companies with which Amazon has created a contractual relation. Now, Biden's NLRB, which was pretty much the best NLRB we've ever seen, uh, ruled against that. They said, no, we actually think you guys are employees of Amazon. This was a case in Palmdale, California, in northern LA County. And that led to Amazon drivers joining the Teamsters Union in a number of parts of the US, Queens and New York in particular. This just leads to this fury on the part of CEOs like Bezos to dismantle the NLRB, not to mention dismantling his own Washington Post, which he seems determined to do as well. As to the college graduates who are unionizing, I've been following this. There are basically two kinds of workers who try to unionize, and the ones who succeed tend to be workers whose skills are such that they cannot easily be replaced. Because the common management tactic when your workers are trying to unionize is fire them, fire the leaders of that drive. That happens invariably. It's also against the law, but the penalties are negligible. And the Democrats have been trying to, change labor law so that, among other things, the penalties are not negligible, but they have managed to fail every time there's been a Democratic trifecta going back to Harry Truman. So they've never been able to get 60 votes in the Senate. So what you see is university teaching assistants, physicians for the first time, museum docents, people, symphony orchestra, violinists, people you can't easily replace. So if they decide to go union, there's not much management can do, but they're just a small sector, relatively speaking, of the American workforce. And if you're driving an Amazon truck or if you're working in an Amazon warehouse, the way the system works right now, you are out of luck if you try to form a union.
Yeah, and it would simply, it would not be good for the labor movement if unions
If they were
somehow get
all white
coded as like a
collar,
white collar thing
yeah, yeah,
because they're so successful. Yeah,
yeah,
because they're so successful at preventing at union busting and white and blue collar professions.
right,
But again, we've heard so much about the pro-worker Republican Party. And again, what do the CEOs know that the people who are buying that line do not? And I think they know that it's I'm not going to use the term I want to use, but they know it's not true.
right. Right. And they know that, anytime a significant piece of labor law reform legislation comes before Congress, and the Democrats reintroduced one, the so-called PRO Act, earlier this week, maybe just yesterday, in fact, uh, it ain't it ain't likely to go anywhere, even when the Democrats control everything, because it's still getting 60 votes in the Senate is going to be exquisitely hard, and it would require the Democrats to abolish the filibuster, which they have never been willing to do when they actually do have a trifecta. So I should add my personal note. Every Democratic senator signed on to this bill except Mark Warner from Virginia, who is a former CEO and apparently is more of a CEO than he is a Democrat. But anyway, that kind of file that under what Stephen Ratner discovered in his conversations with nominally Democrat CEOs. These things just happen. But I mean, there's a line in Saul Bellows' novel The Adventures of Augie March about, when you're trying to suppress one thing, you can't do it narrowly. Everything springs up. And, that's the Republicans aren't trying to suppress one thing, but by targeting DEI, they are ultimately damaging not just workers who are female or minority status or what have you. It's an anti-worker thing. And going in the anti-worker thing, they're damaging often disproportionately minorities and women. So it's still in many ways a white guy's club and a rich
I mean,
white
Harold,
guy's
you know
club.
this.
Yeah.
It's the same thing they did with the populist movement back in the day. That you go on an anti-worker campaign and you hide it behind the expression of popular bigotries that motivate people against people they actually have more in common with than the people who are trying to manipulate them.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it works.
Yeah.
It worked back then. It's worked many other times. It's worked, in the 1960s and 70s. It's unfortunately it is a tried and true method of manipulating people. But there shouldn't be any surprises here about the fact that the supposedly pro-worker Republican Party is pursuing as many anti-worker policies as possible, and then trying to cover them up, with majoritarian expressions of popular prejudices.
Right. And before 1964, it was Southern Dixiecrats who joined with Republicans over the years after, Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act, the only senator from one of the very few senators from a northern state who voted against it, possibly the only senator from a northern state who voted against it.
Well, he was
Um,
more Western, right? But you mean
yeah, yeah,
non-Southern.
yeah, but that was a signal that the Republican Party was open to the racism previously represented in Congress by Southern Dixiecrats, and that was the beginning of the shift of that mentality and those people into Republican ranks, which took a number of decades, but it's now complete. But if
Oh,
you
well,
look,
well, they started. I mean,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt you, Harold, but that shift towards lily white republicanism, it begins, as you know, in the 1890s. It sort of
yeah,
really manifests in like an explicit strategy that is successful, around the time of the civil rights movement. But this betrayal of black voters by the Republican Party begins much earlier.
yes, and the uh, uh, the specter, I mean, there are the Southern opposition to unions is in a Freudian sense, overdetermined because they were, among other things, fearful that unions might actually, some, not all, but some unions might actually have racially integrated locals, and God forbid so, I mean, there's a reason why the South has always, been opposed to this sort of thing. And, at times the racism and anti-unionism is such that there are six states that have never passed a minimum wage law, for instance, within their own states. Five of them are the Deep South: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee. They don't have a minimum wage law. God forbid we should have to pay blacks a certain amount. And oh yeah, well, this damages white workers too. That's okay. That's
Yeah, look,
the Southern
I mean
system. Yeah,
the sort of the quasi-feudalism of chattel slavery, history matters.
yeah,
Those things last. They have an effect that shapes society for decades and centuries, after they happen. And that's one of the reasons why, to bring it back, why the Trump administration is so intent on censoring any historical instruction related to how that happened.
yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, not only are they completely flouting sort of the basic originalism of being able to read the Constitution and understand it, but it's a complete blotting out of most American history. And you don't have to be an advocate.
They're censoring the history you're supposed to consult,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
in the phrase history and tradition, but you're
yeah. I think you froze there for a second, Adam. Are you?
not actually allowed to consult a history that doesn't comport of what the Constitution is. Yeah, I mean, the way, the line from conservative judges was living constitutionalism. That was the insult. But what they're doing is really undead constitutionalism. It's a sort of necromantic art of saying, of amending the Constitution the way they want to amend it, but insisting that in fact it rooted in a past interpretation.
Well, I've long said that the ism that the Republicans are in this period are most opposed to is empiricism. So that includes both history and current reality. I mean, there was that famous line during George W. Bush's administration with one of the White House officials uh, talking to a journalist who was doubting what they were saying about Iraq and responding that, well, you're in the reality-based community. God forbid Americans should be in a reality-based community. And as you have said several times in this conversation, Adam, what goes on Fox News and what's on a lot of the social media platforms kind of enables you to simply bypass a reality-based community. They're not to be deterred by empiricism. And when you have federal agencies that guide themselves by that, like the National Institute for Health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you don't want them there. You
Yeah, I
want,
mean, this is an assault on
yeah,
empiricism. They are
exactly.
defunding the infrastructure of the United States that allows policymakers to make informed decisions because sometimes that information doesn't say what they want it to say.
Right.
We heard all this stuff for like 10 years about how like wokeness is a religion, but then you have these guys who are essentially saying nothing that contradicts the gospel of Donald Trump can be, researched in academia or through scientific grants. I mean, you have an outbreak of measles here in Texas where I live right now, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services is talking about cod liver oil. Like, this is a terrible situation. And unfortunately, it's only going to get worse because as Donald Trump said about the media, I attack you so that people don't trust you, so that they don't believe you, so that they only believe me. And this is what they want. They want a society where, you know, you cannot refer to empirical evidence to contradict dogma because it doesn't exist. All you have is the dogma. And so
And
you have to believe that.
the layoffs at the NOAA, which is the more or less the Federal Weather Meteorological Research Institution, I think this stems from Trump's grievance that they once reported a hurricane, hit the Florida Panhandle, and he insisted it hit Alabama. And since they didn't, since they resisted saying this, these empiricists who merely locate hurricanes accurately, and you might think that that's a useful function, for people who are in the hurricane's path. Well, never mind that it's a useful function for people who are in the hurricane's path. If somebody there, violated what Trump said in error, that the bureau's got to go down.
The ego of Donald Trump is the most important thing. Although I believe that was actually a Project 2025 suggestion. Don't quote me on that, but I believe the idea of defunding that department was there. I mean, but again, it's like what you say. You don't want any information that might embarrass Donald Trump by the virtue of being true.
Well, I
It's
think we've,
whatever he
yeah, I think we provided some information and some opinion and some sharp judgments over the last hour, which is coming to an end now. So, Adam, I really want to thank you. I want you to hold the
Thank you so
fort.
much for having me. It's always a
Yeah,
pleasure to be back in the
hold the
process.
fort in San Antonio, where you are, be that the Alamo or whatever it is. Uh, and I really appreciate your being here. And we've been talking with Adam Serwer of The Atlantic, and please come back next week when we will be talking with somebody else. And I'm sure we will not lack for material to discuss. That much I guarantee. Adam, thanks again. Good to see you.
Thanks so much.